Hello everyone. Today we will be reviewing the last section of Chapter 9. So although we base our decisions off of this model, of this rational choice theory model, research demonstrates that we are good at estimating the frequency of that event occurring, but not estimating the likelihood that it will occur. So for example, in college you are forced to make a decision about what major you are going to choose. And so this is a lofty decision, as ultimately it has an influence on shaping who you are and who you are going to be after graduation. And so you may go through this decision-making process of, I want to declare a major in biology with a pre-med option, but I'm also very interested in teaching high school English. So from here we would base our decision on the likelihood of us graduating and being accepted to medical school versus getting a job and teaching after we graduate with our bachelor's degree. So in addition to that, not only trying to estimate the likelihood of that occurring, but which one is really going to give us more life satisfaction. So which one is of more value to us. So I think of rational choice theory as weighing the good with the bad and thinking about how likely is the event going to happen. The answer to these questions will lead us then to make a decision. And the problem with this is, do we always take time to think about our decisions in a very thoughtful and rational manner? And so the answer is no, obviously, and we'll look at some reasons why this occurs. And so the first one that we see with decision making and what happens when we may not make such rational decisions, the first one that we see is heuristics. And so heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that are sometimes effective when approaching a problem. So if you've gone through a similar situation, you may make your decision based off what you experienced in the past, rather than sitting there and going through all of the possible pros and cons for each decision that you would make. So if we already went through a similar situation, we may be asking ourselves, why even go through that whole process of trying to make a decision? And this is especially true if we're pressed for time and we have to make a decision right then and there. So we find that although the situation is similar, applying the same decision-making model may not always be the best solution. So say you are taking college algebra classes this semester and you took a similar class in high school. In high school the class was easy and you didn't have to study that much to get a name. So when your college algebra test rolls around, you think, well, I've taken it before and it wasn't hard. This one won't be as hard also. So you only study for about 30 minutes or an hour. And whether you earn a good grade on the test or not, you used a heuristic in making the decision to not study as intensely as you would have in a different class. So similarly, an algorithm is a well-defined sequence of procedures or rules that guarantees a solution to a problem. So an example of an algorithm would be in your classes, if you listen and participate in class, take notes, read the text, and study, you will earn a good grade in class. So you have to follow these clear steps to achieve success in your classes. Another great example when I'm thinking about heuristics and algorithms is if you were baking a cake. An algorithm would be this well-defined sequence of procedures or rules, so that would be the recipe that you have to follow in order to make this cake. The solution is making a great cake that you can share with your friends and family. And heuristics would be, well, if you've already made a cake like that before, you may not need that algorithm or that recipe, and you're going to base your baking off of what you did last time when you baked a cake. So maybe you aren't going to add as much baking flour or baking powder or cocoa powder or whatever it is. So you're basing your baking off of those heuristics because you've already baked the cake before. The next is availability bias, and so availability bias affects our estimation of an event occurring because our memory strength and how many times we are exposed to an event are directly related. So availability bias is a type of memory shortcut and is also considered as a type of heuristic. So availability bias, often people think that airplane travel is more dangerous than car travel because we see every time there's a plane crash and we hardly ever hear about car crashes. So since memories of plane crashes are more available to us, we think they are more likely to happen. And so memory in this case was not due to the greater frequency of plane crashes occurring, but the greater familiarity of seeing plane crashes on the news, maybe daily or once a week. And so what we see with conjunction fallacy is this occurs when people assume that two events are more likely to occur together rather than happening alone. And so people tend to believe that with more and more options, there's a higher probability that they are all true. However, what we do know is that with the addition of any new event, the probability of those events occurring diminishes rapidly. And so the next concept within decision making is a representativeness heuristic. And this is another type of mental shortcut. So an example of this is a stereotype. And so making a judgment about a person based on the probability of them fitting your prototype or your stereotype of their group. So for example, because you are blonde, people may make a judgment about you because of the color of your hair and the stereotype that all blondes are dumb. And so this would be a type of representativeness heuristic. Framing effects occur when people give different answers to the same problem, depending on how the problem is phrased. So if I was to present you drug A and say that we had a 70% success rate of patients experiencing a decrease in their depressive symptoms, you would be more apt to take this medication, as opposed to me presenting drug B and reporting that 30% of people taking this drug did not show any improvement at all. So we know that they both had the same success failure rate, but if I was to only present either the 70 or 30% rate, your decision to take the drug would be heavily swayed. And so this is a type of framing effect. Next is the sunk cost fallacy. And this is where people make decisions about a current situation based on what they have previously invested in the situation. And one example of this is that you may tell yourself that, well, I've already spent so much time and money on Farmville or Candy Crush that if I don't keep playing and spending more time and more money, it will have been a huge waste of all that time and all that effort. And so essentially with sunk cost fallacy, what we see is that when considering this, it's hard for people to cut their losses and move on. And so that's essentially what sunk cost fallacy is. So when we actually look at why do we make these errors, psychologists have developed several explanations for why we fail at making everyday decisions. The first is prospect theory, and this theory argues that people choose to take on risk when evaluating potential losses and avoid risks when evaluating potential gains. And so people simplify their available information. So an example of this would be if choosing a cheap apartment on the strip near campus for $150 per month that has fleas, as opposed to avoiding risk and renting an apartment at the links for $400. Which one? $400 a month. Which one would you choose? And so with prospect theory, this is the explanation for why we may make errors or why we base our decisions on whether we want losses or gains. And so the frequency format hypothesis explains that our minds evolved to notice how frequently things occur, but not how likely they are to occur. And so this is why we may not always be the best at making a rational decision, among other reasons. So it's easier to think about how many times in class we'll have quizzes, so we all know that we'll have 12, rather than think about what's the probability that Ashley will give a quiz this Monday, and should I sleep in and skip class. Probabilities and percentages are, evolutionarily speaking, recent developments that emerged in the mid-17th century. So thus our susceptibility to errors while trying to estimate a probability of an event occurring is not surprising why we may have that difficulty. So how do we then attempt to make a rational, thought-out decision? A means-ends analysis allows us to think and act on steps that will increase the likelihood that we will attain our desired goal or outcome. So this is usually implemented using the following steps. The first one is to analyze the goal state or the desired outcome. So say we want to earn an A in class. The second, analyze the current state where we're starting at essentially. So currently we have about a 78 in class. Third, we list the differences between the current and the desired states. So what am I doing now that is not helping me achieve an A? Am I watching lecture, reading the book, going to office hours to ask questions? Fourth is to reduce the list of differences by direct means. And so this may be visiting with the professor during office hours and bringing questions about the material. It could be generating sub-goals, so breaking down a step. And one example of this would be reading chapter 9, pages 112 through 122 today, and reading the end of the chapter on Monday, for example. The other way we could do this is finding similar problems with a known solution. So this may look like asking a friend who previously took the class and earned an A, and asking them what did they do to be successful in the class. So for the means-ends analysis to be successful, it needs to be well defined by having clearly specified goals and pathways to reach that solution or those goals set in mind. And here we see another type of problem solving, and analogical problem solving is similar to the example I used for heuristics. So here's a similar but different example. So maybe your friend comes to you because she or he is having problems with their boyfriend and girlfriend. And you went through a similar situation with your boyfriend and girlfriend, so you know what solution works or may not work, so you give them advice. And so you're taking what you learned from a previous experience or a previous problem and applying it to a new one. And so this is that analogical problem solving way of making decisions. And so next, here we discuss the involvement of creativity and insight in making decisions. So creativity and insight is almost the opposite of the analogical problem solving technique. So creative and insightful solutions often rely on restructuring a problem so that it turns into a problem that you have already resolved. So even when it feels like a solution came out of the blue, what we see is that research demonstrates that your brain has been working deeply, oftentimes on an unconscious level where you are unaware of your brain actually working through that problem. And so next, related to creativity and insight are framing effects. And so framing effects, these occur when we're attempting to think of a problem in a way that we've already solved or seen in the past, and this can limit our creativity and insight by way of functional fixedness. And so functional fixedness restricts our thinking by only focusing on one way to solve a problem or thinking about the problem and solution. So this is almost like tunnel vision. We think there's only one way of solving the problem, and we don't think outside of the box. Here we have reasoning, and sometimes our reasoning is illogical. So logic is a system of rules that specifies which conclusions follow from a set of statements. So one example, if we stated that Jack and Jill went up the hill is true, then the statement Jill went up the hill must also be true as well. So logic is a tool by which reasoning occurs. And so in order to be reasonable or have reason, we first have to have logic. So practical and theoretical reasoning allows us to make decisions. And the first one that we see on here is practical reasoning. And practical reasoning is where we're trying to figure out basically what are we trying to do. And so thinking about how you're going to get across town to a concert if you don't have a car, this would be a type of practical reasoning. So means-ends analysis is one kind of practical reasoning. The second is theoretical reasoning, and this is used when trying to determine which beliefs follow logically from other beliefs. Research suggests that we're typically better at practical reasoning rather than theoretical reasoning, and this may be because it's easier to figure out what to do rather than to figure out whether these beliefs are logical or illogical. And so that makes sense, because with trying to figure out whether beliefs are logical or illogical may take more brain power, or we may not have the available information to make an informed decision about whether that belief is logical or illogical. And so with that, that wraps up the third section of Chapter 9.